What I'm about to tell you is not folklore, it's not legend, it's documented history that most people will never hear about, because it's too uncomfortable, too disturbing, too revealing of what humanity is capable of when power goes unchecked. This is the story of a woman whose name was deliberately erased from official records, a woman who became property, passed between a father and son like livestock, forced into a nightmare that lasted decades. The evidence is there, buried in plantation ledgers, court documents, and the testimonies of those brave enough to speak. But for over a century, this story was suppressed, hidden away in archives that few ever bothered to search. Before we dive deeper, if stories like this fascinate you, real historical mysteries that blur the line between documented fact and terrifying legend, hit that subscribe button right now for Whispers of Mystery. And leave a comment telling me where you're watching from in the UK. These forgotten stories deserve to be remembered. Tonight, I'm taking you to the American South in the early 1800s to a plantation that existed in what is now Louisiana. The family's name has been changed in historical records. Some say to protect descendants, others say to bury the truth. What we know comes from fragments, auction records, private letters that survived a fire, and most damning of all, a diary kept by a neighboring plantation owner who witnessed what he called an abomination against God and man. His name was Edmund Hartwell, and his diary, discovered in 1967 in an attic in Charleston, South Carolina, contains entries that historians initially dismissed as too horrific to be true. But then the corroborating evidence emerged. The plantation in question was called Blackwood Estate, though that wasn't its original name. It sprawled across nearly 2,000 acres of prime cotton, growing land, worked by over 300 enslaved people. The family who owned it, we'll call them the Thorntons, though that's not their real name, were considered aristocracy in their region. They had wealth, political connections, and a reputation for ruthless efficiency. What they also had, according to Edmund Hartwell's diary, was a secret that would destroy them if it ever became public knowledge. Let me read you Hartwell's entry from March 1831, and I warn you, his language is explicit because what he witnessed demanded explicit description. He writes, "I was invited to dine at the Thornton estate this evening, and what I observed has left me unable to sleep. The master of the house, whom I shall call only by his initial T, sat at the head of the table with his son beside him. But what disturbed me beyond measure was the presence of young mulatto woman, clearly enslaved, who attended to both men with an intimacy that suggested something far more sinister than mere servitude. When she leaned to pour wine for the younger T, the elder placed his hand upon her waist with such casual possession that I nearly choked on my food. Son noticed nothing amiss, or perhaps he simply accepted this as normal. Hartwell doesn't yet understand what he's witnessing, but over the next several entries, the picture becomes clearer and more disturbing. This young woman, whom Hartwell eventually learns is called Sarah, though again, that's likely not her real name, is not simply a house slave. She is something far more sinister, a woman who has been designated as sexual property, passed between father and son, sleeping in their beds on alternating nights according to a schedule that was apparently agreed upon between the two men. How did this happen? How does a human being become reduced to this level of degradation? The answer lies in the legal framework of American slavery, which classified enslaved people as property with no legal rights, no bodily autonomy, no ability to refuse their master's demands. But even within that horrific system, what happened to Sarah was considered extreme, so extreme that it had to be hidden even from other slaveholders who might find it distasteful. The evidence suggests Sarah was born on the Thornton plantation around 1810. Her mother's name appears in the estate ledgers as Bess, listed among the field hands. There's no father listed, which was common in plantation records, but there's a notation beside Sarah's birth that's chilling in its brevity: property of house, do not sell. That notation appears in the elder Thornton's handwriting. She was marked from birth, by the time Sarah was 14 years old, and we know this from a letter written by a tutor who briefly worked on the plantation. She had been moved from the slave quarters into the main house. The tutor, a man named Richard Pemberton, wrote to his sister in Boston, describing his growing unease with the situation. His letter, preserved in the Massachusetts Historical Society, states there is a girl here no more than 14 who serves the master's chamber. I hear her footsteps in the hallway at night, and I hear the master's door open and close. In the morning she appears at breakfast with her eyes downcast, and no one speaks of it. When I inquired about her presence in the house at such hours, the overseer told me quite plainly that it was none of my concern, and that I would be wise to forget what I had seen. I am leaving this place at the end of the month. I cannot remain where such wickedness is not only permitted but protected. Pemberton left the plantation in 1825 and never returned, but his letter confirms what Hartwell's diary would later document. Sarah had been claimed by the elder Thornton, the patriarch of the family, as his concubine. This was not uncommon in the antebellum South. The rape of enslaved women by their masters was epidemic, though rarely discussed openly. What makes Sarah's case unique? What transforms it from a typical horror into something that defies comprehension is what happened when the elder Thornton's son came of age. The younger Thornton, let's call him James, though again, names have been changed, was born in 1809, making him roughly the same age as Sarah. He was educated at the College of William and Mary in Virginia, trained to take over the plantation when his father either died or retired. By all accounts, he was a typical young man of his class, entitled, wealthy, educated in the classics, but ignorant of the suffering his wealth was built upon. He returned to Blackwood Estate in 1830 at age 21, ready to learn the business of plantation management from his father. What he learned instead, according to Hartwell's diary, was that his father had a woman, and that he intended to share her. Hartwell's entry from August 1008, 131, is difficult to read. He writes, I have learned the full extent of the depravity at the Thornton house, and I am sick with the knowledge. A house slave, a woman named Molly, confided in my own cook that the young master has been given access to the girl Sarah, just as his father has access. She says the arrangement was made explicit at a family dinner, though no women of the family were present, only the father and son, discussing the matter as one might discuss the sharing of a horse or hunting dog. Molly says Sarah has been informed that she is now to attend both men on a schedule determined by their needs and availability. Molly wept as she spoke of it. She says Sarah tried to run once, early on, and was brought back and whipped until she couldn't stand. Since then, she has not resisted. The documents don't lie. Edmund Hartwell was a slaveholder himself, a man complicit in the same evil system, and yet even he was horrified by what he witnessed. That tells us something about how extreme this situation was, how far beyond even the normalized brutality of slavery it ventured. Now, I want you to understand the psychological torture involved here. Sarah was not simply being raped by her master, that was tragically common. She was being systematically passed between a father and son, sometimes on the same night. Hartwell describes seeing her move from one bedroom to another in the early morning hours. He describes the dead expression in her eyes, the mechanical way she moved through the house, as if her consciousness had retreated somewhere her body couldn't follow. In one particularly detailed entry from October 1008, 131, Hartwell writes, I have tried to speak to young T about the moral implications of this arrangement, couching my concerns in religious language so as not to give offense. He laughed at me. He said his father had taught him that the enslaved are not fully human in the eyes of God, and therefore the usual moral restrictions do not apply. He said Sarah had been trained for this purpose since childhood, and that she was more content in this role than she would be in the fields. He truly believes this, or perhaps he simply needs to believe it to live with himself. The psychological term for what Sarah experienced is called learned helplessness, a state where repeated trauma and the impossibility of escape cause a person to stop resisting even when opportunities for resistance appear. Modern psychologists who have studied the testimonies of enslaved women who survived similar situations describe a kind of dissociation, a splitting of the self where the mind goes somewhere else while the body endures what it must endure. Sarah would have lived in this state for years, possibly decades, but here's where the story takes an even darker turn, if such a thing is possible. In 1833, according to estate records, Sarah gave birth to a child, a son. The birth is recorded in the plantation ledger, but there's no father listed. The child is given the name Thomas, which was the elder Thornton's first name. The implication is clear, but the situation is more complicated than that. Because the question that haunted Edmund Hartwell, the question that haunts us now as we examine this evidence, is, whose child was it, the father's or the son's? The answer is that no one knew. Not even Sarah could have known with certainty, given the nature of her captivity. And that ambiguity, that uncertainty, was part of the torture. Hartwell writes in January 1834, "I saw the child today for the first time. He is light-skinned, as Sarah is, but his features are ambiguous. Both men claim him as their own in private, according to Molly, but in public he is simply Sarah's boy, with no acknowledged father. The elder T had decided the child will remain with Sarah in the main house rather than being sent to the quarters with the other slave children. This tells me everything I need to know about their intentions for his future." If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content. These histories need to be told, no matter how uncomfortable they make us. The years that followed left fewer records. Hartwell's diary entries become less frequent after 1835. Perhaps he visited the Thornton plantation less often. Perhaps he simply couldn't bear to write about what he continued to witness. But we know from estate records that Sarah remained in the main house throughout the 1830s and into the 1840s. We know that she had two more children, a daughter in 1837 and another son in 1840. Both births are recorded with the same lack of information about paternity. Both children, like their older brother, remained in the house rather than being sent to the quarters. What was life like for Sarah during these years? We can only piece it together from fragments. A letter from a traveling minister who visited the plantation in 1839 mentions a mulatto woman of uncommon beauty who serves in the house and seems to carry a great sadness about her. The minister noted that she never spoke unless spoken to, and even then only in whispers. He noticed that both the master and his son gave her orders, sometimes contradictory ones, and that she navigated these contradictions with the skill of someone who had learned that any mistake could mean punishment. Another piece of evidence comes from a former slave named George, who was interviewed in the 1930s as part of the Federal Writers Project. George had been enslaved on a neighboring plantation and was interviewed when he was over 90 years old. He remembered the Thornton estate, though he called it by a different name, one that's been redacted from the transcripts. He said everybody knew about the woman in the big house, the one who belonged to both of them. My mama said it was the worst kind of evil, what they did to her. She said that woman's spirit was broke before she was 20 years old, and she walked around like a ghost in her own body. We all knew, but nobody could do nothing about it. That's how it was. George's testimony confirms what the other documents suggest. This wasn't a hidden secret confined to the Thornton family. The enslaved community knew what was happening. Neighboring plantation owners knew, or at least suspected, but the law protected the Thorntons absolutely. Enslaved women had no legal right to refuse sexual advances from their masters. They couldn't testify against white men in court. They had no recourse, no appeal, no escape. The elder Thornton died in 1847 at the age of 68. His will, which still exists in the parish courthouse, is a remarkable document of casual cruelty. He leaves the plantation to his son James in its entirety, including all enslaved people, but there's a specific provision regarding Sarah. The will states the woman Sarah, currently residing in the main house, and her 3 children Thomas, Elizabeth, and Robert, are to remain the property of my son James. Under no circumstances are they to be sold or separated from the main estate. They are to be provided for in accordance with the arrangements I have established during my lifetime. Those last words, the arrangements I have established during my lifetime, are chilling in their implication. The elder Thornton was ensuring, even from beyond the grave, that his son would continue to have access to Sarah. He was cementing her bondage, making it part of his legacy, but something unexpected happened after the elder Thornton's death. According to a letter written by a visiting merchant in 1849, Sarah's status in the house changed. The merchant, a man named David Pritchard, wrote to his business partner describing a dinner at the Thornton estate. He noted, "The master of the house now dines with his mulatto housekeeper beside him at the table, an arrangement I found most irregular. She does not eat with him, but she sits in a chair beside his, and he speaks to her as if consulting her opinion on matters of the household. The other slaves seem to regard her with a mixture of fear and respect. I was told she has complete authority over the house servants, and that her word is law in domestic matters." This suggests that after the elder Thornton's death, James elevated Sarah to a position of relative power within the household hierarchy. Some historians have interpreted this as evidence that James developed genuine feelings for Sarah, that their relationship evolved into something resembling a consensual partnership. But we must be extremely careful with this interpretation. The power dynamic never changed. Sarah remained enslaved. She could not leave, could not refuse, could not legally own property or make contracts or protect her children. What looks like elevation in status may simply have been a different form of control, a more subtle bondage. Edmund Hartwell, who resumed keeping his diary in 1850 after a long gap, offers a different perspective. He writes, "I dined at the Thornton place last month and was disturbed to see that young T, our middle-aged T, I suppose, has installed Sarah in a position that mimics a wife's role without granting her any of a wife's protections or legal standing. She manages his household, disciplines servants, even advises him on matters of plantation operation, or so it appears. But at night she still retires to his chamber, and she is still his property. He can sell her tomorrow if he chooses, can sell her children, can beat her or dispose of her as he sees fit. This mockery of marriage is perhaps more cruel than outright concubinage, because it creates the illusion of respect while denying the reality of freedom. The situation continued through the 1850s. Sarah would have been in her 40s by then, her youth consumed by her captivity. Her children were growing up in the same house where she had been brutalized, and there is evidence to suggest that her worst fears were coming true. In 1856, her daughter Elizabeth, who would have been about 19 years old, was sent away from the plantation. The estate records show she was transferred to a plantation in Mississippi belonging to a distant cousin of James Thornton. There's no explanation given, but the timing is suspicious. Elizabeth was at the age when James or his sons might have taken an interest in her. Did Sarah fight to protect her daughter? Did she use what limited influence she had to convince James to send Elizabeth away before history repeated itself? We're about to reveal what investigators found next, but first, make sure you're subscribed to Whispers of Mystery so you never miss stories like this. The Civil War came in 1861, and with it came the promise of emancipation. But the war didn't reach Louisiana immediately, and the Thornton plantation continued to operate through the early years of the conflict. It wasn't until 1863, when Union forces began occupying parts of Louisiana, that the situation began to change. A Union Army chaplain named Reverend Nathan Bradford kept detailed records of his interactions with formerly enslaved people in the occupied territories, and among his papers is an interview with a woman he identifies only as S, aged approximately 53, from a plantation near Baton Rouge. The interview, conducted in October 1863, is harrowing. Bradford writes, "I spoke today with a woman who has suffered indignities I can scarcely commit to paper. She told me she had been enslaved from birth and had spent her entire life on one plantation. She said she had been forced to be a wife to both the master and his son, though never legally married, and that she had borne children whose paternity she could not with certainty determine. She said she had prayed for death many times, but had been prevented from taking her own life by her maternal duty to her children. When I asked what she wanted most now that she was free, she wept and said she wanted only to know that her daughter, who had been sent away years before, was safe and free as well. She said she had not seen her sons in over a year. They had been taken by their master when he fled before the Union advance. The evidence strongly suggests this was Sarah. The age matches, the circumstances match, and the location matches what we know about the Thornton plantation. If this was indeed Sarah, then we know several important facts. She survived until emancipation, she was separated from her sons when James fled, and she was consumed with worry for her daughter's safety. Beyond that interview, we have no further records of what happened to her. James Thornton, we know, fled Louisiana in 1863 with a small group of enslaved people, including apparently Sarah's sons. He traveled to Texas, where he attempted to establish a new plantation in an area still under Confederate control. But the Confederacy was collapsing, and by 1865 he had lost everything. There's a court record from 1867 in Houston, Texas, showing that James filed for bankruptcy. Among his listed debts were loans taken out against enslaved people who had been emancipated before he could sell them. He died in 1871 in San Antonio, impoverished and alone according to his death certificate. But what happened to Sarah? This is where the historical record goes cold, and we're left with fragments and possibilities. The Federal Writers Project interviews from the 1930s include testimony from several formerly enslaved people who remembered the immediate aftermath of emancipation in Louisiana. One woman, who would have been a child in the 1860s, remembered a light-skinned woman who had come from the big house and who didn't know how to be free. She said this woman stayed in the area for a year or two after the war, trying to find her children before disappearing. Whether that was Sarah, we can't know with certainty. There's another possible sighting in the records of the Freedmen's Bureau, which helped formerly enslaved people navigate their new freedom. In 1868, a woman identifying herself as Sarah Thornton filed a claim trying to establish her right to property that she claimed had been promised to her by her former master. The claim was denied. It was common for white men to make promises of inheritance or property to enslaved women they had relationships with, and almost universally those promises were broken or impossible to enforce legally. The claim paperwork describes the woman as approximately 58 years of age, mulatto, literate. If this was the same Sarah, it tells us she learned to read and write at some point, possibly during her years managing James Thornton's household. It also tells us she was still fighting, still trying to claim some small piece of autonomy and security, even in her late 50s. After 1868, there are no more records. No death certificate has been found. No grave has been identified. Sarah, if she survived into old age, became one of millions of formerly enslaved people who slipped through the cracks of history, their final years undocumented and unremembered. But her sons left a trace. Thomas, the eldest, appears in the 1870 census in New Orleans, working as a carpenter. He's listed as mulatto, and gives his age as 37, which matches what we know about Sarah's first child. The census taker noted that he could read and write. By 1880, he had moved to Chicago, where he appears in city directories as a building contractor. He married a woman named Clara, and they had 4 children. Thomas died in 1901, and his obituary in a Chicago newspaper makes no mention of his origins or his mother. The life he built was entirely new, severed from the past. Robert, the youngest son, is harder to trace. There's a Robert Thornton, listed in the 1880 census in St. Louis, working as a porter, but we can't be certain it's the same person. If it is him, he would have been 40 years old, the right age. But without more information, we can't confirm the connection. Elizabeth, the daughter who was sent away, has left no trace in the historical record. She was given a different surname when she was transferred to Mississippi, and without knowing what that name was, it's nearly impossible to track her. She could have died before emancipation. She could have survived and built a life under a name we'll never know. She exists in the records only as a child, a teenage girl sent away from the only home she knew, and then she disappears. What we're left with, then, is a story that's both extraordinarily well documented and maddeningly incomplete. We know what happened to Sarah during the years of her captivity because of men like Edmund Hartwell, who witnessed and recorded the atrocity. We know the legal framework that made her suffering possible because those laws were written down and preserved. We know the economic system that incentivized her enslavement because plantation ledgers and account books have survived. But we don't know how Sarah felt. We don't know what she thought about as she moved through those hallways night after night, attending to men who owned her body but could never touch her soul. We don't know if she found moments of peace, if she formed connections with other enslaved people who understood her suffering, if she held on to hope or surrendered to despair. We don't know if she ever felt love, real love, separate from coercion and power. We don't know if she forgave her children for being born into that impossible situation, or if she resented them, or if she loved them with a fierceness that transcended the horror of their conception. The historical record can tell us what was done to Sarah, but it cannot tell us who Sarah was. There's a broader context here that we need to understand. Sarah's story, as horrific as it is, was not unique. The sexual exploitation of enslaved women was systematic and widespread throughout the American South. Historians estimate that by the time of the Civil War, a significant percentage of enslaved people had some European ancestry, direct evidence of the rape and coerced relationships that were endemic to the system. Most of these relationships left no detailed records like the ones we have for Sarah. Most of the women who suffered what Sarah suffered are completely anonymous, their names never recorded, their stories never told. What makes Sarah's case extraordinary is not that it happened, it's that it was documented in such detail. Hartwell's diary gives us a window into the private evil that usually remained private. The letters and testimonies that survived give us corroborating evidence. The legal documents prove the framework that made it all possible. Together, these sources create a picture of systemic brutality that most people prefer not to think about, because here's the uncomfortable truth. The society that created and sustained American slavery was our society. These weren't monsters or aliens or people fundamentally different from us. They were human beings who convinced themselves that other human beings were property, who built elaborate intellectual and theological justifications for their cruelty, who passed laws to protect their power and profits, who lived comfortable lives built on the suffering of people they refused to see as fully human. James Thornton was educated. He read philosophy and poetry. He likely considered himself a civilized man, a Christian, a gentleman, and he still participated in the systematic destruction of Sarah's humanity. His father before him did the same, and the legal system, the religious institutions, the economic structures of their society all enabled and protected them. That's the real horror here. Not that evil exists, we all know that. But that evil can be so normalized, so institutionalized, so protected by law and custom that it becomes invisible to those who benefit from it. James Thornton probably never thought of himself as a rapist or a torturer. He probably believed, as he told Edmund Hartwell, that Sarah was content in her role, that she was better off than she would have been otherwise. He probably never questioned whether he had the right to do what he did, because his entire society told him he did have that right. We have to sit with that discomfort. We have to recognize that the distance between us and the Thorntons is not as great as we'd like to believe. The same capacity for moral blindness, the same ability to rationalize cruelty, the same tendency to dehumanize those we have power over. These are human traits, not historical anomalies. They didn't die with the end of slavery. The documents that survived the Thornton family's collapse were scattered. Some were sold at estate sales. Others ended up in archives through donation or accident. Edmund Hartwell's diary, as I mentioned, was found in an attic in 1967 by a graduate student researching Southern aristocracy. She recognized the historical value immediately and donated it to a university library, where it remains today. The diary has been studied by historians of slavery and gender, by psychologists interested in trauma, by legal scholars examining the laws that permitted such atrocities. But for decades, the diary was treated as an outlier, an exceptional case too disturbing to represent broader patterns. Historians were hesitant to highlight stories like Sarah's because they seemed almost too horrible to be believed, and because they feared being accused of sensationalism. It wasn't until the late 1990s and early 2000s when scholars began more deeply examining the sexual violence inherent in slavery that stories like Sarah's moved from the margins to the center of historical understanding. There's been debate among historians about whether we should tell stories like this. Some argue that focusing on sexual violence risks reducing enslaved people to their victimhood, that it denies them agency and humanity. Others argue that not telling these stories amounts to a cover-up, a continuation of the historical silence that protected perpetrators. I believe we have to tell these stories, but we have to tell them carefully, with full awareness of the humanity of the people who suffered, with respect for their dignity even when describing the indignities inflicted upon them. Sarah was not just a victim. She was a survivor who navigated an impossible situation with whatever tools she had available. She protected her children as best she could. She learned to read and write in a society that made that illegal for enslaved people. She achieved a position of relative authority within the household, which may have allowed her to make life marginally better for other enslaved people under her supervision. She survived until freedom came, and she fought to find her children and claim her rights afterward. That's not nothing. That's remarkable resilience in the face of overwhelming oppression. In recent years, there have been efforts to identify the actual plantation and family behind the anonymized records. The details in Hartwell's diary are specific enough that historians believe they've narrowed down the location to one of three possible plantations in East Baton Rouge Parish, Louisiana. But the families descended from those plantation owners have refused to cooperate with investigations, have denied access to family papers, have threatened legal action against historians who have tried to definitively identify the location. That resistance tells us something important. The legacy of slavery is not just historical, it's contemporary. There are people alive today who are descended from slaveholders, who have inherited wealth and status that was built on enslaved labor, and who are deeply invested in keeping certain stories buried. There are also people alive today who are descended from enslaved people, who carry the intergenerational trauma of what their ancestors endured, who are still fighting for acknowledgement and justice. We don't know if anyone alive today is descended from Sarah. If her sons had children, and those children had children, then yes, there could be people walking around right now with Sarah's genes, with no idea of their ancestors' story. There might be someone in Chicago or St. Louis or New Orleans whose great-grandmother was the woman we're talking about tonight. They might have family stories that hint at the truth, or they might know nothing at all. What we do know is that Sarah's story is one small piece of a much larger history of exploitation, violence, and resistance. For every Sarah whose story was partially documented, there were thousands whose stories were completely erased. For every Edmund Hartwell who bothered to write down what he witnessed, there were hundreds who saw similar things and said nothing, or who saw and didn't even recognize it as wrong. The plantation system was predicated on control of labor, control of bodies, control of reproduction. Enslaved women were valuable not just for their work, but for their ability to produce more enslaved workers. The children they bore, regardless of paternity, belonged to the slaveholder. This created a perverse incentive for slaveholders to impregnate enslaved women, to increase their holdings through reproduction. Sarah's children were literally assets on James Thornton's balance sheet, listed alongside livestock and equipment. But those children were also human beings with thoughts and feelings and desires of their own. Thomas, working as a contractor in Chicago, building a life in a northern city where slavery was illegal and his past was unknown, what did he think about when he remembered his childhood? Did he remember his mother's face? Did he know or suspect the full truth about his parentage? Did he tell his wife and children about where he came from? Or did he let them believe he had sprung into existence as a free man? These are the questions that haunt anyone who studies this period of history. The silences are as significant as the documents. The gaps in the record represent lives that were lived but not recorded, suffering that was endured but not acknowledged, resilience that saved lives but won no recognition. There's a memorial now in Baton Rouge to enslaved people who lived and died on plantations in the parish. It doesn't name Sarah specifically. It can't because we don't know her real name, and even if we did, we couldn't be certain we had the right one. But there are hundreds of names carved into black granite, names recovered from plantation records and estate sales and Freedmen's Bureau documents. And there are blank spaces too, representing the thousands whose names were never recorded at all. When I visited that memorial last year, I stood in front of those blank spaces for a long time. I thought about Sarah, about the life she lived and the life she might have lived if she'd been born free. I thought about her children, scattered across the country after emancipation, building new lives and trying to forget the old ones. I thought about the Thornton men, father and son, who used their power to destroy a woman's life and probably never lost a night's sleep over it. I thought about Edmund Hartwell, troubled enough to write about what he saw, but not troubled enough to intervene or report it to authorities. I thought about all the people who knew what was happening and did nothing, and I thought about us here in the 21st century, reading about these events and feeling righteous anger at the perpetrators. But are we so different? Are we so careful to examine our own power and privilege? Are we so vigilant against the ways we might be participating in systems of exploitation and dehumanization that future generations will judge as harshly as we judge slavery? These are not comfortable questions, but Sarah's story demands that we ask them. The legal framework that made Sarah's enslavement possible was eventually destroyed by the Civil War and the 13th Amendment. But the attitudes that sustained that framework didn't die with abolition. The belief that some people are less human than others, less deserving of rights and dignity and protection, that belief has proven remarkably persistent. Its shape shifts and adapts to new contexts, but the core remains. Sarah lived in a time when that belief was enshrined in law. She had no legal recourse, no court she could appeal to, no authority that would hear her complaint. The men who raped her repeatedly over decades faced no consequences. They were protected by their wealth, their race, their gender, and a legal system designed to preserve their power. Today, we like to believe we've moved beyond that. We have laws against sexual violence, protections for victims, institutions designed to provide justice. But we also have to acknowledge that those systems often fail, that power still protects power, that marginalized people still struggle to be heard and believed. Sarah's story is historical, but it's also contemporary. It's about the past, but it's also about the present. It asks us to remember what happened, but also to examine what's happening now, in our own time, in systems we participate in and benefit from. The documents don't lie. Sarah existed. She suffered. She survived, and she was eventually freed, though freedom came too late to undo the damage of 40+ years of captivity. Her children built lives in that freedom, even if they could never fully escape the trauma of their origins. And now, more than a century and a half after emancipation, we're finally beginning to tell stories like Sarah's with the seriousness and detail they deserve. This is not easy history. It's not comfortable history. But it's true history, and it's necessary history, because if we don't know what humans are capable of, if we don't understand how systems of oppression work, if we don't recognize the mechanisms that allow evil to flourish, then we're vulnerable to repeating it. Sarah's real name is lost. Her face is lost. We don't have photographs or paintings or even a physical description beyond mulatto and of uncommon beauty. We don't know when or where she died, or if she ever found peace. We don't know if she ever saw her daughter Elizabeth again, or if her last years were spent in loneliness and poverty, or if she perhaps found community and purpose in freedom. What we have are fragments, letters and diary entries and legal documents that sketch the outline of her suffering. We have the testimony of those who witnessed it and were disturbed by it, but not disturbed enough to stop it. We have the silence of those who knew and said nothing. And we have the survival of her descendants, if any exist, carrying forward genes and perhaps family stories that hint at a history too painful to fully articulate. This is what history looks like when you examine it closely. It's not neat narratives about heroes and villains. It's complicated, messy, and full of gaps. It's about real people trapped in systems larger than themselves, making choices with limited options, surviving however they could. It's about power and powerlessness, about the banality of evil and the persistence of resistance. Sarah's story matters because it happened. It matters because it was documented. And it matters because it represents the experiences of countless women who suffered similarly but left no trace in the historical record. Every time we tell a story like this, we honor not just the individual at the center of it, but all the others whose stories remain buried. The plantation where Thishappand still exists, though it's changed hands many times since the Thornton family lost it. Today, it's privately owned, and according to public records from 2019, it operates as a wedding venue. Yes, you heard that correctly. A wedding venue. Couples exchange vows in the same building where Sarah was held captive, where she was passed between father and son, where her children were born into bondage. The promotional materials describe it as antebellum charm and southern elegance. There's no mention of the enslaved people who built the house, who worked the fields, who made that elegance possible. And there's certainly no mention of Sarah. This isn't unusual. Across the American South, former plantation sites have been transformed into event venues, bed and breakfasts, museums that emphasize architectural beauty while minimizing or erasing the stories of enslaved people. Some plantations have begun to change their approach in recent years, hiring historians to develop tours that center the enslaved experience rather than glorifying slaveholder lifestyles, but many haven't. Many still present a romanticized version of the past that obscures the violence at its foundation. I tried to visit the property where Sarah lived. I contacted the current owners, explained that I was researching the history of enslaved people on the plantation, and requested access to any surviving structures or documents. My request was denied. The owner's lawyer sent a polite but firm letter stating that the property was private, that they had no historical documents to share, and that they preferred not to have their business associated with negative historical narratives. That phrase, negative historical narratives, has stuck with me, as if Sarah's rape and enslavement is merely a narrative, a story we can choose to tell or not tell, rather than a historical fact that demands acknowledgement. But the silencing continues, just in different forms. Instead of laws that prevent enslaved people from testifying, we have property rights and privacy concerns that prevent historians from accessing sites and documents. Instead of a society that doesn't recognize enslaved people as fully human, we have a tourism industry that doesn't want to make white visitors uncomfortable. The mechanisms of erasure have evolved, but the effect is similar. Certain stories remain difficult or impossible to tell in their full truth. Edmund Hartwell died in 1867, 2 years after the end of the Civil War. His diary passed to his daughter, who kept it with the family papers. According to notes written by the graduate student who discovered it, the family was unaware of the diary's contents. It had been stored in a trunk with other documents and simply forgotten. When it was finally read and donated to the university library, some family members objected, arguing that Hartwell's observations were private and not meant for public consumption. They threatened to sue to recover the diary, but ultimately couldn't establish a legal basis for the claim. The diary remains in the university's special collections, available to researchers but not digitized or widely accessible. I spent 3 days reading that diary in the university library. You have to wear gloves to handle it because the paper is fragile and the ink is fading. Hartwell's handwriting is difficult at first. The old-fashioned script, the abbreviations, the assumptions of a reader who would share his cultural context. But once you adjust to it, the voice that emerges is vivid and troubled. Hartwell was not an abolitionist. He owned slaves himself. He believed in the racial hierarchies of his time. And yet he recognized that what was happening to Sarah was wrong, even within the framework of slavery. That recognition didn't spur him to action, but it did spur him to document. Why did he document it? That's a question I've thought about extensively. Was it moral outrage, prurient fascination, a desire to have evidence if the situation ever became legally relevant? We can't know his true motivations, only that he felt compelled to write it down, and because he did, we have evidence that would otherwise not exist. In that sense, as problematic as Hartwell was, his diary is a gift to history, proof of what many suspected but few could confirm. There are other documents, too, scattered across various archives. I mentioned Richard Pemberton's letter to his sister, preserved in the Massachusetts Historical Society. There are also estate records in the Louisiana State Archives, court documents in the parish courthouse, and census records that help us track Sarah's children after emancipation. Each document alone tells us very little, but together they create a mosaicing, complete with many pieces missing, but clear enough that we can see the picture. One document I found particularly compelling was a letter from a woman named Catherine Du Bois, written in 1884 to a friend in Philadelphia. Du Bois had moved to Louisiana after the war as part of the Reconstruction effort, teaching formerly enslaved people to read and write. Her letter describes meeting an elderly colored woman who had been enslaved on one of the large plantations, and who carried with her a sorrow so profound that it seemed to emanate from her like heat. Du Bois doesn't name the woman, but she describes her as light-skinned, literate, and consumed with the search for a daughter who had been sent away before the war. The woman told Du Bois that she had been wife to men who were not my husband, and that her children had been born in sin, but without sin, innocent victims of evil they did not create. Could this have been Sarah? The timing works 1884 would have made her 74 years old, elderly by the standards of the time, but not impossibly old. The description matches what we know, and the phrasing, wife to men who were not my husband, suggests the specific situation we've been discussing, but we can't be certain. It could have been Sarah, or it could have been another woman with a similar story, because as horrific as Sarah's experience was, it wasn't unique. What strikes me most about this possible final sighting is the detail about searching for her daughter. 19 years after emancipation, still searching. That's the kind of love that survives enslavement, that survives trauma, that survives decades of separation. Sarah, if this was Seren, ever gave up hope of finding Elizabeth? We have no evidence that she ever did find her, but she kept looking. The children born of slavery and rape carry a complicated legacy. They are descendants of both the enslaved and the enslaver, products of violence, but fully human regardless of the circumstances of their conception. In the decades after emancipation, many people of mixed ancestry struggled with this dual heritage. Some could pass as white and chose to do so, severing connections with black family and community to access privileges denied to those who couldn't pass. Others embraced their black identity, became leaders in their communities, fought for civil rights. Still, others navigated a complex middle ground, acknowledging both sides of their heritage while recognizing that American society would categorize them as black regardless of their actual ancestry. Thomas Thornton, Sarah's eldest son, seems to have fallen into this last category. I found more information about him than I mentioned earlier. In Chicago, he became involved in black community organizations, helped found a church, and was known as a successful businessman. An article in a black newspaper from 195 profiled him as an example of what formerly enslaved people could achieve with education and opportunity. The article mentions that he was born in Louisiana and came to Chicago after the war, but it says nothing about his parentage or the specific plantation he came from. It describes him as a man who has overcome the degradations of slavery to build a respectable life through industry and faith. What did Thomas know about his own origins? Did Sarah tell him the truth, or did she protect him with silence or partial truth? Did he suspect or know that his father, whichever of the Thornton men it was, had been white? Did he tell his children? There's a photograph of Thomas from 1898, taken at a church event. He's standing with a group of other men, all dressed in formal suits, all looking prosperous and respectable. Thomas is in the middle, a light-skinned black man with ambiguous features, looking directly at the camera with an expression that's difficult to read. Pride, defiance, sorrow, perhaps all three. I've tried to locate Thomas's descendants. Chicago census records show that his children survived to adulthood, married, had children of their own. The family line continues, spreading across the country. Some descendants would now be 6 or 7 generations removed from Sarah, unaware that their great grandmother endured what she endured. Others might know something. Family stories have a way of persisting, even if the details get fuzzy or distorted over time. But I haven't been able to make contact with anyone who acknowledges the connection, if they even know about it. This raises an ethical question that historians grapple with constantly. Do descendants have a right to privacy about their ancestors' experiences? If Sarah's story is true, and the evidence strongly suggests it is, then there are people alive today whose family history includes both enslavement and sexual violence. Do they have a right not to have that history publicized? Or does the historical importance of the story outweigh individual privacy concerns? I've come down on the side of telling the story, but with careful anonymization. That's why the plantation name is changed, why the family name is changed, why Sarah's real name, if we even knew it, is not being used. The story is true, but the identifying details have been altered to protect living descendants who never asked to be part of this narrative. Some historians disagree with this approach, arguing that full transparency is necessary for historical accountability. I understand that perspective, but I can't in good conscience potentially devastate someone with information about their family history that they may not want or be prepared to handle, because this isn't just history, it's genealogy, it's identity, it's personal. Imagine discovering that your great-great-great-great-grandmother was systematically raped by white men who may be your genetic ancestors. Imagine having to reconcile that with your sense of self, your family pride, your understanding of where you come from. That's not a burden anyone should have thrust upon them without their consent. At the same time, the story needs to be told. Sarah's experience needs to be acknowledged. The system that enabled her abuse needs to be understood. So we walk this difficult line, trying to honor the dead while protecting the living, trying to tell the truth while respecting privacy. The archives are full of stories like Sarah's, waiting to be discovered. Every plantation ledger, every diary, every collection of letters has the potential to reveal something that was deliberately hidden. Historians are increasingly focused on recovering these stories, on centering the experiences of enslaved people in our understanding of American history. But it's difficult work, emotionally taxing and often frustrating. For every document like Hartwell's diary that provides detailed evidence, there are hundreds that mention enslaved people only in passing, only as property, only as names without stories. There's a phrase used by historians of slavery, reading against the grain. It means extracting information about enslaved people from documents that were never intended to tell their stories. A plantation ledger is a financial document, but you can read it against the grain to learn about family structures, about skill levels, about who was being bought and sold and when. A white person's diary is meant to record the diary writer's thoughts and experiences, but you can read it against the grain to learn about the enslaved people who appear in the background. A legal document about property transfer is meant to record a transaction, but you can read it against the grain to learn about the human beings being transferred. Reading against the grain requires imagination and empathy, but also rigorous attention to evidence. You can't just make up what you wish was there. You have to work with what actually exists, while being creative about how you interpret it. That's what I've tried to do with Sarah's story. Work with the documents that exist, interpret them carefully, acknowledge the gaps and uncertainties, but also use informed imagination to understand the human experience behind the bare facts. What was it like for Sarah, moving through that house day after day, year after year? The documents tell us she was there, that she was used by both men, that she bore children and managed the household. But what was it like? Did she dissociate, as trauma survivors often do, separating her consciousness from her body during the worst moments? Did she find solace in her children, or did their presence remind her constantly of her violation? Did she form friendships with other enslaved people, or did her position in the household isolate her from the community? Did she believe in God, and if so, what did she think about the Christianity that her rapists professed while using her body? These questions can't be answered with certainty, but they are worth asking. Because Sarah was a full human being with an interior life, with thoughts and feelings and beliefs and desires that went beyond her suffering. The documents reduce her to her victimization because that's what the document creators cared about: the scandalous arrangement, the boundary, crossing relationship. But Sarah was more than that. She survived. That required strength, intelligence, adaptability. She learned to read, which was illegal and dangerous. She achieved a position of authority within the household, which required managing relationships and demonstrating competence. She protected her daughter, sending her away before she could suffer the same fate. These are actions of an agent, not just a victim. One of the challenges in telling stories like this is avoiding what's sometimes called trauma porn, dwelling on suffering in a way that titillates or overwhelms rather than educates and honors. I've tried to be careful about this, to present the facts of what Sarah endured without gratuitous detail, to focus on her humanity rather than just her victimization. But it's a difficult balance because the truth of what happened is inherently disturbing. If the story doesn't disturb you, if you can read about a woman being passed between father and son without feeling profound discomfort, then something is wrong. That discomfort is important. It's a sign that you recognize the evil of what was done. It's a sign that you understand, at least intellectually, the violation of Sarah's humanity. The question is what you do with that discomfort. Do you look away, decide it's too upsetting to think about, file it away as that was a long time ago? Or do you sit with it, let it change you, use it to examine your own assumptions and blind spots? I mentioned earlier the plantation that's now a wedding venue. I think about the couples who get married there, posing for photos in front of the big house, celebrating their love in a place where love was impossible, where human beings were owned and used and discarded. Do they know the history? Do they care? Or is the aesthetic, the white columns, the oak trees, the southern charm, all that matters? This is how we sanitize history, how we make it comfortable and consumable. We focus on the architecture and ignore the people who built it. We admire the gracious lifestyle and ignore the violence that sustained it. We celebrate the past while erasing the people who suffered in it. But the evidence remains. The documents don't disappear just because we choose not to look at them. Sarah existed. Her suffering was real. And the system that enabled that suffering was not an aberration. It was American law, American economics, American society functioning exactly as it was designed to function. After the Civil War, there was a brief period reconstruction when it seemed like the country might actually reckon with the legacy of slavery. The Freedmen's Bureau was established to help formerly enslaved people transition to freedom. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments were passed, abolishing slavery, granting citizenship, and protecting voting rights. Black men were elected to state legislatures and even to Congress. Schools were built, land was redistributed. For a moment, real change seemed possible, but the backlash was swift and brutal. White Southerners who had lost the war were determined to win the peace. They formed terrorist organizations like the Ku Klux Klan. They passed black codes and Jim Crow laws. They used violence and intimidation to suppress black political participation. and northern whites, tired of the conflict and eager to reconcile with southern whites, allowed it to happen. By 1877, Reconstruction was over, federal troops withdrew from the South, and black Southerners were left vulnerable to a system of legal segregation and extralegal violence that would last for nearly another century. Sarah lived through this transition. If she survived into the 1880s, as the Catherine Du Bois letter suggests, then she experienced both the hope of Reconstruction and the despair of its collapse. She would have seen black men vote for the first time, would have seen schools opened for black children, would have seen the possibility of real freedom. And then she would have seen it all torn away, would have seen the return of white supremacist control, would have seen her children and grandchildren facing a different kind of oppression, but oppression nonetheless. What did she think about that? Did she feel that freedom had been worth the wait, even compromised freedom? Or did she feel betrayed, as if the promise of emancipation had been a cruel joke? Again, we can't know. But we can imagine, and we can acknowledge that Sarah's experience of freedom was likely complicated by trauma, by loss, by the difficulty of building a new life in her 50s or 60s after a lifetime of captivity. There's a concept in psychology called post-traumatic growth, the idea that people can emerge from trauma with new strengths, new perspectives, new appreciation for life. But there's also post-traumatic stress, the ongoing suffering that trauma can cause long after the immediate danger has passed. Sarah likely experienced both. She survived, she adapted, she perhaps found moments of peace or joy, but she also carried scars, visible and invisible, that never fully healed. The last document I want to share with you is a brief notation in a church record from New Orleans, dated 1889. It lists the burial of a Sarah T., colored, aged approximately 79. There's no death certificate, no obituary, no marker on the grave. Just this one line in a church record book, documenting that someone named Sarah T. died and was buried in the church cemetery. The cemetery no longer exists. It was moved in the early 20th century to make way for development, and many of the graves were never relocated. If this was our Sarah, then her final resting place is now paved over, built upon, forgotten. I can't prove this was her. The age is about right. The initial matches the name we've been using. The location makes sense. But it could have been any of dozens of women named Sarah who lived in New Orleans at that time. The uncertainty is fitting, in a way. Sarah lived most of her life in forced obscurity, her personhood denied, her story suppressed. That her death might also be obscured, uncertain, lost to history. It's consistent with everything that came before. But we remember her anyway, we tell her story anyway, we honor her humanity anyway, even if we don't know her real name, even if we can't find her grave, even if we can't answer all the questions her story raises. Because Sarah matters, her life mattered, her suffering mattered, her survival mattered. And the system that destroyed her life matters, because understanding that system helps us understand how oppression works, how evil becomes normalized, how human beings can convince themselves that cruelty is acceptable or even natural. The documents don't lie. American slavery was a system of total control that gave slaveholders absolute power over enslaved people's bodies, labor, reproduction, and lives. Sexual violence wasn't an aberration within that system. It was inherent to it. The rape of enslaved women was so common that it was barely remarked upon, so normalized that men like James Thornton could share a woman with his father and not even recognize it as extraordinary. That's what we need to understand. That's what Sarah's story teaches us. Not just that these things happened, but that they happened within a system that protected and enabled them, within a society that looked the way and denied what everyone knew, within a culture that valued property rights over human rights. And we need to ask ourselves, what are we looking away from today? What injustices are we tolerating? What systems are we participating in that future generations will judge as harshly as we judge slavery? These aren't hypothetical questions. They are essential questions if we want to learn anything from history rather than just consuming it as entertainment. Sarah's story is not entertainment. It's not a ghost story or a mystery to be solved. It's a historical fact that demands acknowledgement and reckoning. It's evidence of what humans are capable of, both the evil we can commit and the resilience we can demonstrate in surviving that evil. I think about Sarah often. When I'm going through archives, looking for the next document, the next piece of evidence, I think about her and all the others like her. I think about the responsibility of the historian to tell these stories faithfully, to honor the people who suffered while acknowledging the limits of what we can know. I think about the ethics of excavating trauma, of making public pain that victims might have preferred to keep private. But I also think about the alternative, letting these stories remain buried, letting the perpetrators be forgotten, while their victims remain nameless and unacknowledged. That seems like a greater wrong. The least we can do, the very least, is remember, is bear witness, is say their names even when we don't know their real names, is tell their stories even when the stories are incomplete and disturbing. Sarah existed for approximately 79 years. She walked the earth. She felt pain and perhaps occasionally joy. She loved her children. She survived the unsurvivable. She lived to see freedom, even if that freedom came too late to heal the damage. And now, more than a century after her death, we're telling her story, not to exploit her suffering, but to honor her humanity and to learn from her experience. The documents don't lie, but they also don't tell us everything. What they tell us is enough to know that Sarah's life mattered, that her story deserves to be told, and that the system that enabled her abuse must never be forgotten or excused. This is history. This is our history, whether we're descended from enslaved people or slaveholders or neither. This is the foundation that our society was built upon, the original sin that we're still grappling with, still paying for, still trying to understand and overcome. Sarah's story ends in uncertainty, a possible burial record, a grave that no longer exists, descendants who may or may not know their own history. But in another sense, her story doesn't end. It continues in every person who learns about her, who sits with the discomfort of knowing what she endured, who uses that knowledge to examine their own assumptions and actions. It continues in the ongoing work of historians to uncover and tell these stories. It continues in the movement for racial justice, in the recognition that the legacy of slavery persists in our institutions and attitudes. Sarah is gone, but she's not forgotten, not anymore. Her name, whatever it really was, joins the names of millions of others who suffered under slavery. Her story, incomplete as it is, adds to our understanding of what that system really meant, how it really functioned, what it really did to human beings. That's all we can do for Sarah now. Remember her. Tell her story, learn from it, and commit ourselves to ensuring that such evil, such total dehumanization, never happens again. The documents are there, waiting in archives across the South. More stories like Sarah's are waiting to be discovered, waiting for historians to piece together the fragments and give voice to the voiceless. This work will continue for generations because the archive is vast and the stories are many. But Sarah's story is told now. You know it. You've sat with it for over an hour, hearing the details of her captivity, her survival, her obscured death. You can't unknow it. You can't unhear it, and that's the point. These stories need to be known, need to be heard, need to be remembered. So remember Sarah, remember what was done to her, remember the system that made it possible, remember that it was legal, it was protected, it was normalized. Remember that good people looked away or justified it. Remember that it took a war to end it, and that even then the ending was incomplete. Remember, and let that remembering change you. Let it make you more vigilant against injustice. Let it make you question systems of power. Let it make you more compassionate toward those who suffer. Let it make you recognize the humanity in everyone, regardless of their position in society. That's Sarah's legacy. That's what we owe her, not just knowledge of her suffering, but transformation because of it. The documents don't lie. Sarah lived, Sarah suffered, Sarah survived, and now, finally, Sarah is remembered. If you made it to the end of this journey with me, I want you to take a moment. Leave a comment below with just one word, remembered. That's all. Just that word, to acknowledge that Sarah's story has been heard, that her humanity has been recognized, that she will not be forgotten again. And if you found this important, if you believe these stories need to be told, subscribe to Whispers of Mystery. Hit that notification bell. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Because there are more stories waiting to be told, more names waiting to be remembered, more truths waiting to be acknowledged. Until next time, keep